Hello everyone and welcome to listen to the Lion-Faced Guru podcast. My name is Kim Katami, I'm your host, and today I'm interviewing Lama Lyse, who is a good friend and mentor and teacher of mine. And first I would like to begin with a short introduction of Lyse. Lama Lyse is a long-time and close student of Dilgo Khyentse and Chatral Rinpoche. Both were great figures of the Nyingma-school of Tibetan Buddhism. She lived close to Dilgo Rinpoche for 6 years until his passing in 1991, and then continued her studies with Chatral Rinpoche, which lasted another 28 years until his passing in 2015, including an 8-year retreat directly under his guidance. Lama Lyse trained in the Longchen Nyingtik tradition of the Nyingma Lineage, but leans towards a wide view which encompasses Advaita and Dzogchen. Her teaching style is one that focuses on the great question, who am I? And emphasizes a sincere and dynamic form of practice which each student is invited to experience fully and authentically within the basic Dharma structure of prayers such as Refuge, Bodhicitta and Dedication. She also teaches from texts such as Patrul Rinpoche's Heart Treasure of the Enlightened Ones and the 3 words that strike the vital point in a free, simple and straightforward style. Lyse is originally from New Zealand but has lived in India and Nepal for 35 years. She has maintained a blog, Ever Here Now, since 2013 and has written several books that are available through Amazon, for example. So hello Lyse, and welcome to this interview and podcast.
Hi Kim.
Welcome. Yeah. This is actually the first interview ever that I'm doing, so this is something new for me, but nevertheless I wanted to interview you. The way how I first came to meet you was through Facebook. I saw your image there and was impressed by the purity and clarity that was shining through your Facebook profile picture, and that was maybe 2-3 years ago, over 2 years ago anyway. And since then, I contacted you and we've stayed in touch since. So welcome again, Lyse. So should we start from the beginning? Can you tell us about your childhood and early experiences that led you to the spiritual path?
Sure, Kim. Yeah. As you already mentioned, I was born in New Zealand, and I was very fortunate to grow up in a small town called Nelson, which is at the top of the South Island. It's a very beautiful little town. Our house overlooked the ocean. It was a place called Tahunanui, and it overlooked the Tasman Bay. And at the back of the bay, or on the other side of the bay, were mountains. So it was a really lovely place to grow up. Beautiful area, just a small provincial sort of town. I was the 3rd of 4 children. And I think because I wasn't the first and I wasn't the last, I was there in the middle. I was able to sort of disappear into the family unit, I suppose, more than perhaps the others could have done. And I was naturally a very reserved child, quite shy. Mm-hmm. And nothing very remarkable about the early years that I remember, until a very fateful day. And I suppose I was about 7 years old. It was a beautiful spring day. I know my cousins were there and we were all playing outside the kitchen. And I remember that very well. We had a trellis with a rose bush that grew right over the trellis there at the entrance to the house. And I don't know, I don't remember what we were doing, except we were sort of running around here and there. Quite unaccountably, during that playtime, I just suddenly had the urge to sit down. And I just remember leaning up under the kitchen window. Our windows used to open outwards like that, and it was partly open. And I was just leaning up against the wall and looking out, and the others continued to play and they went off somewhere. And suddenly this question just dropped into my mind. What am I doing here? You know, what's this? Where am I? Who am I? You know, it wasn't even so much that my mind was asking that question. It was a kind of shocking revelation. It was like waking up somewhere that you've never seen before, and suddenly becoming aware of this alien place, this strange environment. And that's what that moment felt like. And then almost simultaneously to that shock came this immediate, I'm not sure what word you would use for that, perhaps understanding, or just, it was much deeper than understanding. It was cellular. In fact, it was even deeper than that. It didn't have anything to do with the body. It was just a profound, inherent knowing that what we are is awareness, just that. And that awareness is everything. And everything that I was looking out on was part of me. And I was part of that. There was no distinction, there was no separation. So it was an extraordinary experience. I had no way to validate it or to understand it intellectually. I was such a young child. And that could have been a good thing, because I couldn't, begin to dismantle the experience with my mind. It wasn't something that I could try to, and being a child, being so raw, so young, so open, I simply took it that everything, it was just what it was. That was the truth. There was no questioning it. It was just simply known. So that was my first real moment of, what would you call it? It was a very important experience and a pivotal moment in my life, the very first one, for sure. And then, my mother came along and she opened the window, and somehow that she was like surprised that I was sitting there. So she sort of broke the spell in a way. But I remembered that the fragrance of the experience lingered for quite some time.
Yeah.
And of course, I never forgot about the experience. I never forgot that, that moment. It's just fresh to me now as when it actually happened.
How about were your parents, or are they spiritual or religious? Was there any influence of that kind in the family?
Not really, no. I mean, my father was Polish Catholic, and he was very strict about us attending church every Sunday, which we all thought was a bit of a bore. But my mother was, she was much more, perhaps she, certainly my grandmother, were very, just naturally spiritual and a very open way. There was nothing contrived about that, but one just sensed that about them, particularly my grandmother, who, was very much that way, just naturally. And in fact, I think in my younger years, she was definitely my mentor, my guru in a way, my first guru. She was someone I really looked up to, and everybody loved her. She just had something about her that was extremely appealing to young and old and all kinds of people. So even I remember in her 80s and 90s, all kinds of different people were coming to visit her when she was living in Motueka after my grandfather passed away. So she just, yeah, she was a special sort of person, yeah. And then a number of years passed. I know I was quite a bit taller. I remember that because at that time my grandparents had sold their farm and they had bought a retirement home at a place called Kaiteri, which is a very beautiful series of inlets on the other side of the bay from Nelson. It was a lovely place. And so suddenly, instead of, you know, our little treat would be that we would each go alone and stay with our grandparents for a week or two. And so we all took these turns. And I always look forward to those times so much. On the farm, you know, there was so much freedom. And they had a boxer dog, and, you know, the dog and I would just run around all day under the walnut trees and exploring the different farm buildings and, you know, running after rabbits and just, you know, really, you know, doing kids stuff.
Yeah.
And then they sold that place and they bought this place in Kaiteri. And there it was just suddenly, you know, all that space was contracted into a house, but the house was in this area of amazing beaches and inlets, and there was a lot of forest around and so on and so forth. So I remember during one of those stays, one of those visits, I was down on the inlet as the tide was going out. And in that area, when the tides go out, it's a very, very strong pull, very strong, and they empty out those inlets completely.
Yeah.
And they're just little fine rivulets. When it's completely low, that's all there is in there. But when the tide's full, you know, it's like a whole blue bay, and it's almost unrecognizable. So this really big shift in tides there. And my grandparents always said to me, be really careful, don't swim when the tide's going out, you know, you'll get pulled out with the rip and all that kind of thing. And I certainly listened to them. But one day while I was down on the, what would you call it, on the sand embankments, and the tide was already, you know, quite advanced in its regression out to the sea. I was on a little sort of sandbank playing away, and then that bank caved in, and suddenly I was thrown into the water. And it happened so quickly, I had no time to do anything, and certainly couldn't get out because the pull was very strong, and I got sucked under. And then, you know, just be this sort of thing going on, and then eventually I was out in the sea. So I remember it was a very mixed up sort of time. I was thrown around by this really strong current, and eventually it kind of spat me out, and I realized I was out in the open bay. So it probably would have been between 30 and 50 meters out. And once I got spat out of the rip, it was fairly calm. It was just our calm inlet water. But the rip itself with the tide was being pulled out. So I realized that, you know, there was nobody there. I was on my own. and I had to get back to shore. So I just somehow, the wisdom of turning over onto my back and just flapping my feet and moving my arms, that just, you know, somehow I just did that instinctively. It was very, very frightening, and it was very, very shocking incident. I certainly had thought that I was going to drown while I was being dragged out. And when I got out, I was extremely exhausted. So by the time I was on my back and just, you know, doing this movement to move myself in, I was too exhausted to swim. I mean, my mind had just stopped working. There wasn't any sort of thinking going on. It was just this really instinctive thing to try to get back to the shore, but absolutely no certainty that I would actually be able to do that.
Yeah.
And a really intensely lonely feeling. Like, you know, there really wasn't anyone around that saw what happened, that it could be shared with, who could help. So I knew it was up to me to get back. You know, there was no one was going to come and pull me out.
Right.
And I just kept going. It was a kind of dogged thing. You know, it was just like, keep going, keep going, keep going. Then eventually my shoulder bumped the sand and I realized I'd made it back to shore. And I pulled myself out. And there was an overwhelming sense of, well, so many emotions, you know, just so many emotions that a young child of probably 9 or 10 wouldn't really even have words for.
Yeah.
You know, it was really a very decisive moment for me. And suddenly everything became very precious in terms of life. So that was the second experience that shook me around.
Yeah.
And really ruffled my sense of reality. And the third experience happened probably 2 or 3 years after that. Actually, the third experience was when I was in college. I had a friend that I used to cycle to school with every day. I guess we were around 12 years old at that time. And our school was, it always seemed really, really far from where I lived, because in Tahunanui we had to go down a very steep hill and then cycle for many miles along the road. And in those days, no helmets or anything like that. It was all very sort of free and impromptu. So she and I used to team up, and we would make these trips every day to and from school. And it would take us at least 40 minutes. It was quite a thing. So, you know, we got quite close in a way, and we were always chatting and interacting and sharing things and so on and so forth. So over the years, that was the routine. She and I would team up because she lived a few houses up from me, and off we would pedal on our bikes to school, and then we would push them back up that huge hill to where we were living afterwards. And then one weekend, I got the news that she had died, that she had been killed in a motorbike accident. It seems that she had gone out with a boy on a motorbike, and he had missed the bridge, and it had gone straight over into the riverbed and killed them both instantly. And I just never forget the shock of hearing about that. And then the shock, because in those days we didn't have any kind of real support with regards to death. Nobody really talked about it. There certainly were no kind of counseling or anything of that kind.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it was just, you kind of had to get on with stuff. And, you know, once the funeral was over, everyone just sort of went on as normal, as though nothing had happened. And to me, that was really shocking, because on the Monday when I went to school, which I was expected to do, and then I had to go into the class, and I remember everybody turning around and looking at me, but nobody said anything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then, you know, we got on with our lessons and things, and I sat there thinking, this whole thing is just meaningless. It's completely meaningless. Someone just died. You know, this person, which I knew, that just was so remarkable to me, you know, and this whole thought of, well, what was it in her that died? Where did she go? How could that happen? What does that mean? So all these questions came up in my mind, and they were not in any way attended to by anyone, and were not answered. So, yeah, life went on, and I think these questions were instilled in me at a very early age.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, when I was listening to you, from that early experience when you had that recognition of your natural condition, natural state, and then those two dramatic and where the first one with the life-threatening experience, and then the closeness of death. A lot of spiritual people have similar experiences when they meet death, and these basic things that shook up the mind. And one question that came to my mind from what you told is that, did you feel like you fit in with other children, or as a teenager, did you feel like you fit in, or?
Not really.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was a bit of a struggle. I mean, I did have friends, and I certainly tried to fit in, but in my own inner self, I think I was always extremely, I felt very out of place. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that would have to be admitted to.
Yeah. Yeah. Same for me. That's why I asked that, because I can relate to, through my own traumatic and dramatic experiences early on. I also had the same problem, that I had friends, but I didn't really fit in. And I think it's true for many people who are spiritually inclined. Okay. How did you become interested in spirituality and eventually in Buddhism? How did that happen?
Well, I mean, all these things that happened to me as a child and while I was growing up were, enormous incentives to me to scratch below the surface of, our seemingly comfortable, cozy, predictable lives.
Yeah.
Those incidents shook everything up in a way that, it's like when you see something, you don't not see it. It has been seen. So I don't think any of the things that came up through having gone through those experiences ever really left me. But I certainly went through, the craziness of, the teenage years, and there was a boyfriend, and I went off to Australia, and we went, we made our way around Australia, and then we got up to Darwin, which is right at the northern tip of Australia. Very hot up there, and a completely different way of living. Completely different type of people and group of friends from the friends that we had made in the other places that we had visited. And we'd started in Adelaide and gone over to Perth. So, you know, those are the days of people coming and going from India and from Indonesia and, you know, having all these great adventures abroad. And so, I mean, that was kind of an interesting period. I guess it lasted about 18 months. And then one day I just thought, okay, what next, basically? And I don't know why, but I guess it was a logical progression. I decided, okay, maybe it's time to go further east. And further east was Cairns and, you know, the whole Northern Cape there in Queensland. So I took a car. I went ahead of my boyfriend that time, and he'd gone back to New Zealand for a short visit, and then he came and joined me about a month or two after that. Not long after he came back, I just really felt very, very strongly that I wanted to experiment more deeply with meditation. I wanted to learn how to meditate, and I realized that I needed to, well, I felt at that time that I needed to go into a quiet place in order to do that. And I was studying a few other things as well. And it just came up that this place in the rainforest in Kuranda, which was on the tablelands above Cairns at a higher altitude, was available, and that the person who owned that land was looking for someone to stay there and just be there, feed the chickens, look after his dog and keep an eye on things, basically. He only visited very occasionally, maybe once a month. And so I thought, gee, that sounds perfect. So I told my boyfriend of the time, and he was very shocked and not at all impressed. And, you know, but he was good to me, and he agreed to take me up there and help me settle in. So off we went, and a whole new chapter started from there. And I guess that was really the beginning of my first intentional decision that, you know, I wanted to go deeper.
Yeah.
I wanted to scratch the surface. I wanted to learn how to meditate. And above all else, I wanted to know what the mind is, because to me, it felt like the mind was key to discovering. There's something about the mystery of mind, how we think, all of that. I hadn't yet understood the distinction between mind and awareness intellectually. So that I went into the forest, and it was a tropical rainforest. I mean, I'd come from Nelson in New Zealand, you know, don't even see big spiders there, you know, certainly nothing poisonous, and never seen a snake before. So, yeah, you know, Kuranda Forest had everything. Had crocodiles in the river, it had loads of snakes, and most of them were incredibly poisonous. Lots of huge hairy spiders, of which we saw a few in the hut when we were cleaning it out. And so it just became this really big adventure. And I remember the first night I sat on my bed. Well, we had been cleaning that hut out because nobody had been in there for many, many months during the day. And Carl was standing on a stool, and he was sweeping out the loft with a broom, and I was doing something down below, you know, and suddenly he shrieked. I nearly died with fright, you know. It was just, he just got, it was such a blood-curdling shriek. And what had happened was a snake had, you know, he swept a snake out, and he didn't have anything on his top. He just had his shorts on. It was really hot. And it just slithered down the front of his chest and down his leg onto the floor. But fortunately, it was a tree snake.
Yeah,
So it wasn't poisonous, and we were able to just put it outside.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we got through all that big cleaning thing, and I remember following him to the car, and that was the first moment I had a little pang of like doubt. It's like, what am I doing? You know, geez, am I really doing this? And he was going to go. There were no mobile phones in those days. That was in the 1970s. There was nobody around. I had never been on my own in my life. Never spent a night on my own. Never been away from people. Certainly not in a tropical rainforest. I was 18. So it was really young, and it was really shocking when the cold, spooky reality was right there in front of me. It was just, whoa, am I really going to do this? And somehow I didn't stop him from leaving. I just managed to be really stoic and hold my ground, and once he was gone, that was it. I couldn't call him back. So I was really there. And I remember, it got dark quite quickly. There was no electricity in that hut.
Yeah.
I had a little kerosene lamp, and I remember sitting on the bed, and I put a mosquito net around the bed just to keep mosquitoes out, and perhaps anything else crawly and creepy and slimy. So I was just sitting in there, and I had the lamp on, and I was trying to read a book about meditation. And suddenly I noticed this waving thing in the loft, coming down from the loft just above my bed. And it was the tree snake. It had gone back up there, and it was kind of intrigued by this light in the hut. There hadn't been anyone in there for so long. So it was as curious about me as I was terrified of it. And, I just tucked all the mosquito net around me. It was too dark to go outside. It was completely silent outside. And I just remember, I just sat there. I turned off the kerosene light because I felt safer in the dark. I felt like no one could see in. And, I just sat, and, maybe they wouldn't realize I was there. Animals, people, whoever, anyone. So I just sat there in terror all night, waiting for it to get light. So it was a real shocker. That first night was really hard.
Your first retreat.
My first retreat.
Yeah.
Horror, terror. And there were lots of things moving around the hut, lots of wildlife and animals and strange noises and all that kind of thing. So anyway, the next day I got up and I just thought, God, how am I going to, am I really going to stay here? But I remember just thinking, well, I'm going to have a go. I'm going to give this a go. So I realized the first thing I had to do was just go out there and see where everything was and acquaint myself with my surroundings and so on and so forth, which I did. And after that first night of horror, I was totally fine there. I loved it. The only time I became afraid was when people were around. So I was really at home and at ease, even though I knew there were lots of snakes around and I would see them from time to time and so on and so forth. I got to know where they were, and I respected their space, and they never bothered me. And the same with the spiders, the same with everything else, basically. And just really, it was a real learning curve
Yeah.
something so beautiful about being in a living forest,
Yeah.
because everything in that forest is so alive,
Mm.
particularly a tropical forest. You know, the bird sounds, everything was new, everything was fresh, everything was very, very different. So I just completely allowed my senses to go out and embrace all of it and take it in. And so that was probably 80% of my first retreat,
Mm.
and 20% was sitting. You know, nature itself is just really invasive, pervasive. It really molded my life during that first interlude.
Yeah. I often use that metaphor of a rainforest when I'm guiding and teaching students. I use that image to feel the aliveness of the natural state. And people always get it. When they think of a rainforest, they can connect with the aliveness of the natural state, and it works well. But I haven't been able to go to real like rainforests that often, a couple of times, but we don't have those here, fortunately.
Mm, mm.
Unfortunately. How about like what kinds of meditation or meditations techniques did you practice during that period of your life? Like what kinds of books were you reading and
That's too far back for me,
okay.
Kim. I know I was looking at very simple techniques, and very often I was just falling asleep,
Mm,
or they would turn into games with my little doggy that I have with me soon after that. I know I was studying theosophy, I was studying Raja Yoga, I was all these sort of things. You know, it was really nowhere in particular at all. It
mm,
was a real sort of scramble around trying to find something, and
yeah.
then realizing that I wasn't going to find it there
Mm-hmm,
like that. You
mm-hmm,
know, I didn't know how I was going to find it, but I knew it wasn't going to be like that. And that that time had its beginning and its end. Basically, it had its cycle, and then I needed to move on, and I did. I moved on down the coast of Australia, the eastern coast, and ended up in Sydney. And different things, there was a lot going on during those times. I was training in music, I was training in speech and drama. There were was also studying natural medicines. There was a lot happening in my life, different groups of people I was connecting with, and so on. But throughout all of that, this inner sense of that something was missing, and that I would need to pursue the path that I had embarked on
mm, mm,
in up in Cairns. That was there. It was there in the background of my mind all the time, like a shadow. And then one day, I just made a decision that I really would have to go. And what came up was Tibet. It just suddenly opened up, and I came across an ad in a newspaper.
mm-hmm.
A tour company was offering a very good deal to fly through to Lhasa, and then you would make your way to wherever. And I liked that idea. I liked the idea of going with a little group to start with, and then having the freedom to decide what I wanted to do from that point onwards. So I signed up, and before I knew it, I was on my way. And I sort of put everything in my life at that time on hold for 3 months, and I just went off. So I started in Tibet, and I thought I would be there for quite a while, but I was only there for probably 3 to 4 weeks. It wasn't very long.
Mm.
Um, it wasn't long at all before I found myself moving towards India. And I did the overland trip from Lhasa down to Kathmandu. And then, you know, after a number of different trekking excursions here and there, the last big one that I did prior to meeting my first teacher was up to Mount Everest. So it was in the Khumbu, and on that trip, I sort of deviated from the group of friends that I was with when we were on our way back down to the airstrip. I had got up very early one morning and wandered up a valley off the side of Namche Bazaar, which is the kind of gathering point of a lot of the treks and things that are proceeding on up to Everest. So this particular valley was going, I guess, towards the north, towards Tibet. So I just was wandering around on this path. It was a beautiful morning. It was very early. My friends were all still fast asleep. And I noticed a little monastery really high up on the side of the mountain. And I was just fascinated by that. It was just a little speck. And I thought, what on earth do they do up there? You know, why is that place even there? It was such an unlikely spot. And it had a real attraction for me. So I made this decision in my mind. I mean, right then and there, I started walking towards it. But I realized it was a long way out and I wasn't going to make it because I was not in any way prepared. I don't think I even had a water bottle with me. But I thought, well, the next day I'm going to take my little backpack and I'm going to go up and explore that place. So I went back down to the camp and that was what I decided. In fact, I didn't even wait till the next day. I went and got my things and I made my way up there that same day. And my friends were on their way down to Lukla. We all had flights to catch. That was always a bit of a mishmash getting out of Lukla. You never quite knew when you'd go, and they didn't allocate seats until the day. So there was some leverage room there. So I thought, well, it's not going to matter if I meet them later, or even if I don't meet them, but I just have to go and find out what that place is. So I marched up there, and it was actually a Lama called Lama Zopa's retreat place. He had actually been born up there, and his meditation cave was there behind the monastery. And it's quite an amazing place. It's right up on the side of a mountain called Kumbila. It's on the view from my retreat window, which I went back there and I did retreat there for a number of months, a year or two after that first visit. That view is on the front of my first book, Awareness Comes Knocking. It's just, that was the view from the window. These huge mountains, you know, Tam Serku, all of them, they were all there around Ahmadablam, majestic. It's like being in an aeroplane. So that place, absolutely stunning. And once I discovered I could stay there, I just dug my heels in and stayed for a few days. And I would go and sit in the cave and just meditate in there during that first stay. And I remember going up to the altar one day to examine the photographs on the altar. And there was one little photograph, it was just a black and white, of a very beautiful face of an old Lama. And I was so impressed by it and so taken by it that I immediately went down to the kitchen and asked the Lama, you know, who was the Lama in that little, you know, photo? And he said, well, that's Kalu Rinpoche. And I said, okay, is he still alive? Yes. And where does he live? Darjeeling. And I was just like, ding, 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 you know, all the lights were going on. And so I, right then and there, I made the decision I had to meet him. And within days, I was back down in Kathmandu, And within days of being in Kathmandu, I was on a bus to Darjeeling, basically, or to the border of India. So, yeah, I made a beeline for Darjeeling, and I actually got to meet Kalu Rinpoche. So he was my first ever Buddhist Lama that I had met face to face. And he really had a wonderful presence and softness about him. I always remember him in his little room there in Sonada with he had a coral mala, a rosary, and he would sit there reciting Om Mani Padme Hum, the mantra of the Chenrezig, the Buddha of Compassion. And he had a very husky voice because he had quite advanced tuberculosis that had been in his system for many years.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. So he was really my first Lama, I suppose you could say, my first encounter with a Buddhist master who I immediately sensed was not an ordinary being. And although I only visited him a couple of times during my first visit to Darjeeling, he told me during that visit that His Holiness Dalai Lama was giving an important empowerment in Bodh Gaya, and that perhaps I might consider going to that. Now, I had a ticket to leave from Kathmandu back to Sydney, and I was expecting to do that within weeks of that interview. So I remember being on my way down to Siliguri, where I was going to catch the bus to the border and then go on to Kathmandu. And I didn't have any other thought in my mind. I had remembered that he'd told me about Bodh Gaya, but I had no intention whatsoever of going through India in a bus to Bodh Gaya on my own. I mean, India was such a shock to my system on all levels, and I was so very, very new, and it was much more of a shock than Kathmandu even. So it was a real surprise when something just propelled me to the Patna bus stand, and instead of going to Kathmandu, I went, or to, what is it, Rakastra, the border there, I ended up going to Patna. So my second teacher was certainly His Holiness Dalai Lama. So after several weeks, he did give the empowerments of Kala Chakra in Bodh Gaya. I think it was one of the first, maybe it was the second time that he'd given it. A very extraordinary event, and it really changed my mind in many, many ways. And during the empowerment, also very, very auspiciously, I met Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. So, yeah, that was, of course, the absolutely defining moment. And yeah, I mean, when I took the empowerment with His Holiness Dalai Lama, we all took the refuge vows during that process every day. But after I first laid eyes on His Holiness Khyentse Rinpoche, I realized that I would have to take refuge with him. I would have to ask him if he would guide me as his student. And so, yeah, that was what followed.
Can you describe the moment when you first saw him? Like, what? Can you describe it, please?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so, it's so real to me even now. There was a huge assembly of people gathered for this Kala Chakra empowerment. It was 1985 or 84, winter of 84, I think. People had come from all over the Himalayas and all over the world, actually. But obviously, the Westerners were much less than all the others. There was a vast monks in red robes, I remember that. And then all the Tibetans were behind the monks. And we Westerners had one little section and we were all crammed in there. And it was quite close to the dais where His Holiness was sitting. And at that time, you know, it was just a rough old field, not far from the stupa. It hadn't been developed at all. And so, you know, they'd set up the dais and put the umbrellas and all the coverings and bits and pieces that they do, quite elaborate preparations there. And then behind that was just, you know, more open space, basically. So I remember this old white, well, you know, the car of choice in India for so many decades.
Mm-hmm.
Lord knows why. It was one of the most uncomfortable vehicles you could ever drive, sit in the back, certainly, was the old, what was it, the Austin Mini? Is that, do you remember those cars in India?
Yeah, I do remember, yeah.
Is it an Austin?
Yes, I think.
I can't remember the name. Yeah, they really did, you know, they were big time in India for a long time. Okay. So yeah, this car just drove in and came around and behind the dais of His Holiness, and the door opened. And then this absolutely radiant, huge figure emerged. And I was watching that and then it just suddenly dawned on me, oh my God. And involuntarily, I just leapt up. You know, everybody was sitting, chanting and waiting. We were all waiting. Obviously, we were waiting for Khyentse Rinpoche. I had no idea we were waiting for him. I had never seen him before. I'd never heard of him. So it was all, you know, great shock and surprise to me. So there he was. And he was, you know, assisted in. He had always had leg problems during his life. But I just remembered he was just so towering. He was so big. Everything about him was big. His presence was big. And he was so majestic. You know, he was like a Chakravartin, a sort of king of the universe. He had that sort of way about him. And yeah, Zongtai Khyentse used to call him Mr. Universe. I thought it was very apt. You know, we had these little jokes. But yeah, he had that otherworldliness about him, that more than, you know. So he came around and he was there throughout the whole empowerment ceremonies that went on for several days. So that was my first, you know, when my eyeballs clamped onto that majestic figure, that was the first moment. Yeah.
So that was the first meeting when you saw Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche and, you know, obviously connected, instantly clicked with him. So how did you how did you go to find him, and how did you become his disciple?
Well, I realized I couldn't really take refuge with him in Bodh Gaya during that time, although I did go to see him in his private rooms, in his residence during that, the Kalashakra empowerments. But there were just an endless stream of people going in and out of his room. It was impossible. I realized I would not be able to do that there. So I found out that he had a monastery in Kathmandu at Bodhinath, and the name of the monastery, I found out where it was, and I decided I would go to his monastery and ask him directly. And that's what I did.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I went there and, oh, yeah, at that time, Matthew Ricard was his attendant. So Matthew's now quite well known as a writer and translator for His Holiness, etc., etc. And at that time, he was looking after Khyentse Rinpoche's books and all sorts of, little errands and things like that. And I remember he was there the day that I went for the first time and requested if I could take refuge with His Holiness. And Khyentse Rinpoche said yes, but just go out, wait out there. There was a large waiting area where people would come and go, sometimes during some of the smaller teachings, the doors that connected, that gave privacy to his rooms could just be pulled back, and then that would become like a whole big hall. And so, all kinds of people came and went in and out of this waiting area, and there were seats all around the perimeter of it. And so I chose a seat that looked directly in at Khyentse Rinpoche sitting there in his meditation box, and where I knew he could see me. and I just sat there, and the days went by. 1, 2, 3, and I was thinking, he can't have forgotten me. Here I am from dawn till dusk. But as good as this word, on the fourth day of the morning, he called me in. Suddenly there was, and for the first time in all those days, no people were coming and going. Everything just stopped for a moment. And at that very moment, he said to Matthew, "Go and get her." And I could see him pointing at me. And so Matthew came and got me, and that was when he gave me refuge. And it turned out to be, the auspicious Dakini day, the 25th of the Tibetan month. And yeah, he just, I just remember this huge finger with this long fingernail beckoning me to come in closer and closer to the box. And I was, from beginning to end, I was always in awe of Khyentse Rinpoche. To me, he was just so much more than a human being. Certainly, he totally wowed me in every way. I'd never seen a human being like him. He was really impressive. And I'd certainly never been in the presence of someone who had such, he filled space with his presence. It was almost tangible. You could almost feel it. It had a certain dynamic to it. So, yeah, when he was doing this with that huge fingernail, I was just totally mesmerized. And when I got close enough, he just put this huge hand on my head, and the world basically just disappeared. And that whole time he was reciting the refuge prayers, and it really felt like an empowerment. Something really shifted, and something very precious took place. So that was when I took refuge with His Holiness, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful story. It like when you're talking about Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche or Chatral Rinpoche, I always, my mind stops because the blessings flood in, and I have to really sharpen up to keep going. So can you tell us more about Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and how was it like to study with him? What the study with him, how was it like with you? How was your relationship? Can you describe generally those years with him? How was it like?
Well, as I said, I was, from beginning to end, I was always in awe of Khyentse Rinpoche. He was not an ordinary being in any sense of the word, and I never saw him as such. He was always to me a totally extraordinary being. And I understood very early on that whenever I was near him, I felt different.
Yeah.
Everything felt different. And the more time I spent in his presence, although I knew nothing about Buddhism then, I was so naive, I was so innocent and probably stupid. I knew nothing, just was totally green. But I knew enough to recognize that every time I was with him, there was a feeling of completeness. There was a feeling of just something so much more. And I wanted more and more of that. I felt that I needed to be near him. And so he became absolutely the focus of my life. I never, from dawn till dusk, I made it my business to be around in the monastery. And so I quickly endeared myself to Matthew and and asked him if there were little things that needed to be done in the office, and here and there, and if I could be his little sidekick. So in this way I got to spend all my days there. Sometimes I was doing things with Matthew, or when I wasn't busy I would be sitting in the waiting room just doing my practice, or I would go into Rinpoche's room and just sit in his presence there. And during the winters, he gathered all his students in, his close students, and we're talking about, of course, Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche and a whole array of young lamas who are now out in the world and doing wonderful stuff. Ziga Khandro, Sanjay Nyingpa, Sonyi Rinpoche, Mingyur Rinpoche. All these lamas would come in the winter, and of course Chechen Rabjam, his great grandson. And during those precious months, they would request, and Rinpoche would give them different lineage teachings. And they were not big gatherings, they were just small groups of basically these lamas. And some 1 or 2, 3 or 4 maybe Western students who were fortunate enough to be around. And usually if you were there for the first empowerment, you could be there through the whole thing if it went on for a few days. So you were part of this very select small group. And the doors would close into Rinpoche's room and we'd all be there, and those times were just so precious. It felt so blessed in there, so cozy and safe and so blessed. And so many winters were spent in that way, and many hundreds of empowerments and teachings were received in that way. But also because Dilgo Khyentse was who he was, and he was quite similar in many ways to Dzongsa, to Choki Lodro, who the talkers for Choki Lodro is Dzongsa Khyentse. He was a teacher of teachers. So lamas from all the different lineages would come to him. Sakya, Nyingma, Kaju. That wasn't, you didn't see that very often. And he was that figure. So one didn't have to go anywhere. If I did spend my whole day at the monastery, I would never know who was going to turn up. It could be Sakya Trinzen. It could be, Khandro Tsering Chödrön. So many lamas, Namkai Norbu, great masters in their own right, all from all lineages. They came and went. And usually whenever they would come, they would request something, And so I'd slip in and be part of that. And if it was something very serious, I always asked Rinpoche. I always found Matthew, and I went and asked that we asked. And Rinpoche never said no.
Yeah.
So, yeah, those are very, very precious times indeed. So basically, the years with Dilgo Khyentse were just a total inundation of the senses on every level. And, you know, being very new to the whole Buddhist scene, I didn't know what to make of it all. So I didn't try to make anything of it. I just let it all flow around me, you know. And also during those years, Rinpoche did many, many drupshins, or 10-day ceremonies, when he would gather in the temple downstairs and with all the monks from the monastery, and they would do the ceremony. And it was really quite an amazing process to be sitting there through those ceremonies for those number of days. I think a really pivotal moment in my relationship with Khyentse Rinpoche was during one of those ceremonies. And it was in the evening, just before the conclusion of the pujas for that day. Although they continued throughout the night, that was usually just a small group of lamas that would continue the recitations. But at the end of each day, there would be what they called a dakini dance, and some of the young lamas would be dressed in all their bone ornaments and bits and pieces, and they all had a bell and a domaru, and they'd be ringing this in a circle, and it was very mesmerizing. And I remember I wanted to, one particular day, I took my camera along. I had a big camera at that time. And I thought, I'm going to get some photos of this. I'll do it today. So I had that over my shoulder. And I got up from my place where I'd been sitting, and I went around the back of Rinpoche's throne. And I was standing on the side. And this dance was going on in front of me. And I turned around and looked up at Rinpoche, and it was just one of those moments. I felt as though a light came from him, and it just struck me. And my mind just stopped. Everything stopped. So I suppose one would, you know, if one was to sort of look into that later and say, well, what was that experience? Well, it was an introduction to the nature of mind. It was a direct transmission, mind to mind. And it happened in a moment when I was completely ripe for it. My mind was totally open. I had complete trust and devotion to Rinpoche. My thoughts had stopped, you know, because this wonderful ritual was going on in front of me. And so it was just a moment when it could happen. And in that, you know, when your teacher, the teacher that points out the nature of mind to the student, and the student that recognizes it, that becomes a very, very special bond. And in Tibetan Buddhism, they call that the Tsawe Lama, or your root Lama. He becomes your main Lama. So he's pointed that out. Not only pointed it out, it was recognized by the student. There's a real meeting of being in that. And so that happened in his presence on that particular day. And yeah.
What year might that have been? Like, was it, how long after you came?
Not long. It would have been about 2.5, maybe 3 years after I met him.
Okay.
Wasn't long.
Yeah.
It wasn't very long, about halfway through our time. Yeah, because he lived another 6 years. Yeah. So, yeah, so those years, basically in his presence, I mean, I did request quite a few private teachings from him, which he always very, very kindly acquiesced to, but nothing ever came close to that particular experience that day, which was just, you know, beyond words, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah. So that all through those years, those were times when I was just like a sponge. I was just taking it all in, basically, and receiving many teachings, many empowerments, all kinds of impressions, you know. Yeah.
Okay. So, and how did that happen when he passed away in 1990, 91?
91.
91. So how did that period, how was it like, and how did your life and path continue after Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche passed away?
Right. Well, he left for Bhutan in, it would have been April or May. From Kathmandu, he flew to Bhutan. And that was his normal routine. He would go every year for a number of months of retreat. And I felt, I understood that year that I mean, I suppose I couldn't accept it with my mind, my intellect, but my heart knew that he was going and it was going to be a really big deal. And it really, really was for me. I could feel like, you know, maybe I wasn't going to see him again. And that turned out to be the case.
Yeah.
Not long after he left Kathmandu, I went on a pilgrimage to Mount Kailash. So he was still alive then, and I was taking things with me that he had given to be placed there at the lake and on the mountain. So a number of lamas had given different things. So it was a real kind of mission, and that pilgrimage was very, very special for me. And part of the specialness was the fact that it had been such a wrench, the way in which he had left that year, and my feeling of desolation, that feeling that followed his departure that particular year. I came back to Kathmandu probably late August or so, and then I went to Australia, and he passed away. And I was in Australia, so yeah, I was far away from all kinds of Dharma supports and in an environment that on many levels always felt very alien and kind of disconnected for me. So that was very, very hard.
Yeah.
Very, very hard to go through that and be in that place at that time. Would have been much easier if I'd been in Kathmandu. I would have gone straight to Bhutan, and I could have been there through all the, you know, the ceremonies that were going on at that time, and it would have felt very, very different. So yeah, I think I got back 3 or 4 months later, and then I made my way over to Bhutan. So
Yeah. And how did it exactly go? Like, how did you, from those moments when you came back, how did you meet Chatral Rinpoche then? How did that?
Right. Well, Chandra Rinpoche, the meeting with Chatral Rinpoche was actually interlinked with Kalu Rinpoche. Kalu Rinpoche and Chatral Rinpoche were very close, and they both had monasteries near Darjeeling. In fact, Kalu Rinpoche's monastery was just a little bit down the road from Chatral Rinpoche's monastery. So they had both known each other in Tibet. and their connection had remained very, very firm and very close. I came to know, while I was with Khyentse Rinpoche in Bodhinath, that Kalu Rinpoche had become very ill. And because he was the first Lama that I had met and formed, you know, a bond with, I had instantly felt that I wanted to go and see him before he passed away. And at that time, another student of Khyentse Rinpoche's, Surya Das, who I believe you know, there. And he and I made that trip together. And I remember Dilgo Khyentse was very confirming that we should both go and be there. And so that's what we did. We took the night bus and we went. And it was very fortunate for me that I was with Surya Das, because he had done his 3-year retreat under Kalu Rinpoche and had a much closer bond with him than I did. And when we arrived in Siliguri, Surya already had come to know that Rinpoche was staying down there. He was not up in Darjeeling. So we got to see him, have private audience with him, and some very, very precious time. So I'm always very grateful to Surya for that. And he was there right through all of what came to pass in the following months. Probably about a month after we reached Sonada, one day I noticed a lot of activity around Kalu Rinpoche's house. And at that time I was in a very tiny little room in a wee house that was very near his house. And my window looked out straight onto his house. So I could see who was coming and going, basically. I just had a bad feeling. I felt that something extraordinary was happening. And I remember going outside and standing outside the house and just thinking, what's going on? And then the next moment, I saw an old Lama with a long white beard moving very, like, in a very determined way up the road. He was walking and he had one Lama assistant with him. And I thought, oh my goodness, that must be Chatral Rinpoche. I'd heard about him. And so when he came past, I bowed down to him and I stuck my head out there. And I remember he very warmly, he put his hand on my head and he said something to his assistant, and then he kept going into the house. And Chatral Rinpoche was there during those final moments of Kalu Rinpoche's before he passed away, and through the next 3 days and nights. So through his tugdam, when he was in the meditation state and all of that, it was Chatral Rinpoche who did the whole thing, the whole ceremony there in the house. So that was the very first time I saw him. And it was interesting because sometime after, people said to me, what are you going to do when, you know, if Khyentse Rinpoche isn't around anymore, who would you study with? What would you do? And I remember saying, I'd never thought about it. I'd never thought it through. I'd never made any kind of plan or decision or anything of that kind about what I would do after Khyentse Rinpoche passed away, because I never imagined that anyone could follow his act. You know, he was all supreme in my life. But I remember someone asking me that question, and I had said, and I never knew where it came from, but I just said, Chatral Rinpoche. It had just been so spontaneous. And interestingly, Dilgo Khyentse had given me a Dharma name, which normally only Chatral Rinpoche would give to his students. Chatral Rinpoche always named many of his students in the line of Sangye, or Buddha. That was his lineage. So Chatral Rinpoche's name was Sangye Dorji. So Dilgo Khyentse called me Sangye Drolma.
Ah,
And when I first actually had a face-to-face one-on-one meeting with Chatral Rinpoche, the first thing he asked me was, well, what's your Dharma name? And I said, Sangye Drolma. And he was like, who gave you that? Very surprised. So somehow, somehow there were these things going on. Yeah. But in fact, when that did come about, it was not long after Khyentse Rinpoche's cremation.
mm-hmm.
And I had gone back to Kathmandu and to Paping, which is on the edges of the valley there, and up to a place called Asura Cave, where Tuku Orgin had a monastery, and I was staying there in a sort of loose kind of retreat. And Chatral Rinpoche came up there one day after one of his close lamas passed away, and that lama was staying in a room next to mine. So that lama was in a meditation state, and on the third day Chatral Rinpoche came up, and it was like 100 steps from where they parked the jeep up to that cave. It was a really big walk, and he was already 86 or something then. I mean, it was amazing. And he came up there as large as life and hardly puffing. So it was really very extraordinary. And I was standing outside my room, and I had a ceremonial scarf of greeting as he came around, and I just offered it to him, and he said, oh, where are you staying? And I just pointed to the room, and he said, come down and see me. So at that time he was staying down the bottom of the hill in a place called Nyingma-school. So I did. I went down and saw him, and then everything started after that. Yeah, it was a very different phase, because all the years that I spent with Khyentse Rinpoche were, I was receiving so much. There were so many impressions coming in, things that I never really understood. I was receiving a lot of teachings, a lot of empowerments, but I had no idea what I would do with any of these things and how I would practice them. But when Chatral Rinpoche came along, he was the Lama who really took me back to step one and through all the stages of training of the path, and often in a very traditional way, but also, on the other hand, very untraditional too. So it was a very complete training that followed on the first period with Khyentse Rinpoche. It was as though Khyentse Rinpoche just gave it all, and Chatral Rinpoche nurtured everything and kind of unpacked it all for me.
Oh.
He took it to the next level, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that came to my mind already earlier, and maybe it's a good question to ask now, that you obviously had to learn Tibetan language to be able to talk with Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And Chatral Rinpoche later? How did that happen? And how did you become fluent in Tibetan?
I never became fluent in Tibetan.
Okay.
Very, very early on, I remember one of Kalu Rinpoche's students. One day, we used to all have lunch together in the monastery. There was a whole big group of translators there at the time when I was staying, and they were working on a project that Kalu Rinpoche, was very dear to his heart. I don't remember exactly what it was, but they were all people that had come out of 3-year retreats, and they had all, at various levels and degrees mastered the Tibetan language. And I remember one of them saying, and I remember her saying quite clearly that telling a little story, and I don't remember the details of the story, but the gist of it was that Kalu Rinpoche said to her, you don't need to learn Tibetan language, just focus on the practice. And somehow that stuck in my mind. And I knew that it would be a real handful to get my head around the Tibetan language. I learned how to read. I could read really quite fluently, to the point where I could join in with the Monlams and Bodhgaya in the winters and stuff like that, you know, go through my practices and so on. I could converse in a very simple way. But my Tibetan language never developed to any great degree. In fits and starts, I would make my efforts, but they always dropped away. And there was always this thought in the back of my mind, I didn't come here to learn Tibetan. I came here to find out what is my true nature. That's my goal. You know, is learning Tibetan, you know, is it really necessary? I could see that there were great people around who had mastered the language, people like Matthew, Annie Jimpa, Lodro Palmo, Chatral Rinpoche, many of his students too were there and around. So I didn't really feel that I needed to be one of those. I just didn't, so I didn't pursue it. And at one point, Rinpoche indicated to me that it would be good for me to learn Tibetan. But it didn't really happen. I remember making an effort. I did start having lessons and following that, but it didn't get very far. So, yeah. And I regretted that, I have to say. But the only time I really regretted it was when I was alone with him. And, you know, during the evenings when we would sit and I'd be rubbing his feet, and that was the story time, you know, that was the time of light banter and conversation and jokes. And, you know, I wasn't ever really part to all of that. But having said that, you know, I was sitting there, and because my mind wasn't engaged in all these stories and, you know, back and forth, etc., going on in the room, I was very much present with his presence. Just in that space. So that was the other side of it. So, you know, there were there were definitely moments when I thought, oh gee, you know, I could have. Because Chatral Rinpoche was just a walking encyclopedia, and his life experience was extraordinary. I mean, you can imagine, born in 1913 in Tibet. You know, there were no cars back then. There was, you know, he was just walking around with a teapot and a tent. On the plateau, you know, he just, and among the nomads, and his life was so incredible and so varied. And it was so, you know, any question you had, he always had an answer to it. It didn't matter what the answer was, he always had one. So, yeah, extraordinary. He knew about medicine, he knew about astrology, he knew scientific things, he knew about masonry, he knew how to build things, you know, just so many things. Herbs, all kinds of stuff. And that curiosity that he had, that interest, never left him, never. It was always there.
So, so he was like a very practical man, practical person. He knew how to. He had that kind of sort of like a. Was he kind of like a craftsman? That he could pick up things.
No, I wouldn't say he was a craftsman as such. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche was the dreamer. He was the poet. He was the inspired Turton. You know, he was he was Mr. Universe. Chatral Rinpoche was one of the most practical people I have ever met in my life. Utterly grounded, really solid, good common sense. You know, his answers to different people's questions and things, it just always amazed me, just how sensible he was. You know? But also amazing, wonderful sense of humor. But all the lamas I knew had wonderful senses of humor. But yeah, a wonderful sense of fun and humor.
Yeah, from like pictures, he seems like a quite serious character. But of course, like picture doesn't, one photograph or few, they don't represent a person. So that's lovely to hear.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh, our days were filled with laughter. So much laughter, so much joy. Yeah, really. He had a very, very insightful and acute kind of humor. It's just so many things, so many incidents. I can't think of anything in the midst of all of that, really, any particular thing that I can bring out. But yeah, all the time with him was filled with joy and lightness. Yeah, he saw humor in pretty much everything. So yeah.
So you stayed with him, you lived with him for quite a while before you wanted to do a retreat. Can you tell us about that transition when how you wanted to go to a retreat, and how was the retreat then?
Right. Well, Rinpoche had indicated to me that Dasmile, which is one of his retreat places near Darjeeling, would be a suitable place for me to go to. And I went down there in the 1990s and I checked out the place and I thought, gee, how could I ever live here? You know, I went on one of those really gloomy, foggy days that you get just after the monsoon up in the West Bengal in the hills, in the foothills of the Himalayas. And, you know, everything was dripping. It was slippery. I fell on my face a few times. There were leeches. And, you know, the monastery just looked very dismal to me. And I thought, oh, God, you know, I was in no way ready at that time. I needed to have those years with him, and he didn't bring it up again. So I think about, a good 8 or 9 years passed before I brought it up again and said, Rinpoche, you know, can I go to retreat in Dasmile? And he was like, yes, you know, about time. So yeah, that transition came about quite slowly. So I needed those years to be with him. There's just an extraordinary sort of alchemy that goes on between a student and a teacher, a fully realized master. And, you know, when you're living in their presence, when you're with them day in and day out, from morning till night, in many different situations, you witness something very remarkable. And that is the way they live. And they don't live, move, and act from a place of mind. They live and move and act from that inner place of their awareness, from their inmost presence. They're completely stable in that. And of course, Chatral Rinpoche was a living example, a monument of that kind of living activity. He was a dynamo. So that was pure Dharma teaching as far as I was concerned. I didn't need anything else. You know, I didn't care if I got any empowerments or teachings or anything. I didn't ask. I wasn't looking for it. I didn't feel as though I needed more than what I was getting in his presence. So, yeah, those first years were all about just being there. And I had, you know, the incredible good fortune to be able to, you know, be an assistant, be nearby him, you know, and do little things for him throughout the day and move around with him. So that was all, you know, very, very moving, often very challenging, extremely tiring on occasions. And yeah, just it was a really very dynamic period. And then I guess that the moment came when I suddenly realized inwardly that period was coming to a close, and that now I needed to go off and be in the forest. So that process started from there. Yeah. And Dasmile, initially I stayed in the retreat center. Later on, I built a little retreat hut about 50 meters away from the retreat center, down on the ridge. So that was where I spent the bulk of my retreat time, down there. Yeah.
And so how long was your retreat? What did you practice? Can you perhaps talk in as much detail as possible about the practices and daily schedule and the nature of the retreat?
I'm probably not going to go into that too much, Kim. But my retreat wasn't a conventional retreat. It wasn't a 3-year, 3-month type retreat.
Yeah.
It was very loose. It was very open. Everyone else that was staying in the retreat at that time were doing the formal 3-month, 3-year retreat during the first period of my stay, except for one old Lama who'd been there for 13 years from Bhutan. He was just, you know, doing his own thing basically and living his practice. So my retreat would not really reflect in any way a conventional retreat. And normally that was how Chatral Rinpoche put his lamas through retreat, and then they would come out at the end of that and they, you know, they had the title Lama. But I went into the retreat absolutely focused and determined to really unravel the mystery of awareness. And I told Rinpoche that as much, in as many words. You know, I went to him and I said, look, Rinpoche, I just, you know, I really want to do this for this and this reason. And he acknowledged that and advised me in the way that was suitable for me at that time. And it was so absolutely perfect for me and suited for me as, you know, where I was at, what I needed, what I basically felt I wanted to do. So he really supported me in that in every way. And yeah, so he basically said I could choose my own times for sitting. I could sit inside, I could sit outside. When I needed things, I could go up to town if I wanted to. But the main point that I was always, always, always to carry with me was to remember my true nature and to practice that in every moment of the day, in every waking moment, no matter what, no matter where, you know, yeah. So basically that was his instruction in a nutshell, and everything moved according to that. So I had great freedom in my retreat. I would go to Darjeeling once a week and get vegetables and food things that I needed. I would spend a part of the day outside if I felt like it, if it was a good day. And I never structured my sitting times to fit within, between 1 and 3 or something like that. I never worked like that. It just really became a flow. And those years were really, particularly the later years, were very, very joyful, very free, and certainly the happiest years of my life. Yeah. Surrounded by beautiful nature and $1 million view of the Himalayas. Countless species of birds, barking deer, all kinds of wildlife. Just marvelous. So yeah, very, very blessed time indeed. I was very lucky.
And how did you did your retreat under the direct guidance of Chatral Rinpoche? So, like, how often did you go to meet him, and how was this getting instructions, and how was it like communicating with him during your retreat?
Well, Rinpoche gave me all the instructions I needed, and really, it was really just in the I suppose I took the text Siksum Nadic to him, the 3 words that strike the vital point. And Rinpoche's instruction was in treck, and he said that would be all that would be needed. Nothing more than that. If I wanted to do any rituals, any chur practice, top offerings, all that kind of thing, that would be basically up to me. So yeah, later on I just put things in there as I felt were appropriate, but it was always at my own discretion. So basically only when I needed to verify things in my practice that I would go to Rinpoche, or if things came up during the retreat that I needed to speak with him about. But he himself came down to Dasmal on 2 occasions. He blessed my retreat house, and he came after another particular incident happened as well. And then after that, I think I was able to visit him on several occasions at Jewel Bungalow, which was just up the road, and then also on several occasions down in Salbari during the winters. So it went that way. Yeah, whenever he was around, I always made it my business to go and see him.
Yeah.
So even though I was in retreat, because it was all so loosely structured, I knew that I could go and meet him. But also during that time, I was also going over to Sikkim, and I was meeting with Longchen Rinpoche and with Khandro Tsering Chödrön.
Yeah.
There, so that was also happening.
And Khandro Tsering Chödrön, she was the spouse and companion of Nyingma Khyentse Rinpoche, right?
Nyingma Khyentse Rinpoche, yes.
Oh, I guess my Tibetan pronunciation wasn't that bad, was it?
Wasn't too bad. Yeah, he was a consort. Yeah.
So now that you mentioned Longchen Rinpoche and Khandro Tsering Chödrön, and you also mentioned Kalu Rinpoche before, would you talk a little bit about other lamas than Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche and Chatral Rinpoche? How was your relationships? Did you study with other lamas, and to what extent?
I did, yeah. I did, and I was very fortunate in that way. As I said, you know, in Bodhanath, where Khyentse Rinpoche was living, every winter became, you know, it sort of became a vortex of teaching and empowerments that he was giving to his close students, and many lamas were coming there during those times, but also, you know, very high lamas, very accomplished lamas were coming to visit him. So I got to meet different lamas within the Sangha of Khyentse Rinpoche, but also, you know, Tulku Ogyen and his sons lived in a monastery just next door, and the two monasteries were very close. And Tulku Ogyen was an extremely accomplished Dzogchen master. I think probably many people who are familiar with Dzogchen would know of him. He was extremely accomplished, great Dzogchen master, and he would give the pointing out instructions pretty much to anyone who came to him and requested them. So I was able to form a connection with him and request those instructions from him one-on-one on a number of occasions, but also able to attend larger gatherings in which he was giving those instructions to bigger groups of students. So Tulku Ogyen, a very important teacher during that period. And then his sons, Choki Nyima, Tsotnyi Rinpoche, Mingja Rinpoche, all of those lamas have been important in my life in very different ways, but each one of them very, very significant. Of course, Khandro Tsering, who I've already mentioned, she was tremendously important to me, and I was able to go and visit her regularly. I think I would have gone twice or even thrice a year during my retreat time, because where she was staying was only a couple of hours away from my retreat centre, and she was always there. Whereas Chatral Rinpoche was often in Nepal, he wasn't nearby at all. So she was also very important. Dodrupchen Rinpoche, yes, important. Amazing Lama. And Chichen Rabjam, the great-grandson of Dilgo Khyentse, was someone who was very important to me during those years. And later, during my years with Chatral Rinpoche, Katok Getse, who had come quite recently from Tibet. And I also formed a close connection with him. So there were a good many lamas, too many even to recount here. I'm just remembering some of the very, you know, things that come immediately to my mind. So I had the great good fortune to meet so many lamas. And of course, His Holiness Dalai Lama. I mean, there were a number of years, probably 5 or 6 years in a row, when I spent my winters in Bodh Gaya, and he would come pretty much every winter. And so I was able to attend teachings and interviews and all kinds of things with him in his presence. And so, yeah, that connection was there as well.
Oh, great. So you ended your retreat, was it in 2009 or 2010, around that time?
Yes, that part of my retreat I completed then. But I would have to say that for a number of years, several years, possibly even it was as long as a decade, I would go back during the summers. So from between 3 and 6 months or longer, I would be staying there in my little, I called it the Tin Palace. And somehow it held together.
A tin palace with $1 million
And
view.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it you know, the very focused time of retreat under Rinpoche's guidance were between the years of 2000 and 2009.
Mm.
And then after that, I would go back regularly and spend those months there. So on a yearly basis, yeah.
Mm.
In fact, only last year I gave it up.
Okay, yeah.
And someone else stayed in there, which seemed kind of unimaginable to me, but yeah. And another Lama was staying there for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So how about southern India and Tiruvannamalai? Can you tell us about that? How did you come up with the idea of moving to southern India?
Yeah, well, an incident happened in Parping. Trying to remember when. Late 1990s, I guess. Probably 1998, 97, something around that time. I came across a book by Paul Brunton, Secret India. Yeah, something. It's a very famous book, so many people may be familiar with it. And I remember flipping through it and then coming across a chapter on Ramana Maharshi, where he is just describing his meeting with Ramana Maharshi and what he felt while he was sitting in the old meditation hall, which was where the Maharshi lived for many decades, just on a sofa in public view there in the corner of this very simple building. And while I was reading it, I just felt so deeply moved by the atmosphere that was pouring through the words somehow. It just felt like it was dripping with blessing from that place, and I felt extremely drawn to it. And then when I kept reading and I discovered the Maharshi's story and how he had a death experience as a child and deeply questioned, who am I? And that had become his central teaching throughout his life. Naturally, given what had happened in my own childhood, I just felt instantly, this is, this is truth for me. It resonated so deeply. Not that I found that different from the Dzogchen teachings. They always had that resonance of truth. That's what it was all about. But the simplicity of the Maharshi's life. To me, he is the absolutely archetypal guru in a way. Just so pure. From the earliest age, when he had his awakening, that never ever changed. He never moved from that place. And his life was lived in the simplest way, absolutely simplest way. And his teaching, which is utterly simple and deeply profound, just touched me, just went straight in. So yeah, that all came through the pages of that chapter of that book by Paul Brunton in Parping in Nepal. And so I had it in my mind, Tiruvannamalai, Arunachala. I heard about that mountain, because Ramana Maharshi, the guru for Ramana Maharshi, his lodestone was the mountain Arunachala. There's always a great mystery to all of us, but that's what it was. a very, very powerful, dynamic place of pilgrimage in the south of India, just south of Chennai. So that was there in the back of my mind. And over the years, I was always thinking, I'd really like to go down and visit at some stage. I'd really like to. And so I just kept it there. It was just sort of, you know, like a time bomb ticking away in the back corner. And then I don't remember what really triggered my making a decision to go down, but it was quite an odd timing. Certainly Westerners normally only visit, or during when I first went in the year 2000, most people came for the winter season. That was the very busy, crowded season, the cooler months, etc. And then everyone would flee mid-February when it would start to heat up, because it would really heat up down there. I mean, that place was furnace. But quite unaccountably, I went down, you know, in the middle of February. I went down when everyone was leaving, and I ended up spending 3 months at Ramana Ashram. I stayed there in the ashram, and I just sat whole days, right up until they would close the meditation hall at night, in the old hall in front of that couch, just steeped in the extraordinary presence and blessing of that place. So I did, that was my first time down there. That was in the year 2000. And as I said, it was a 3-month period, and I didn't go back again until 2009. But I always had it in my mind that I would go back. And so it was really after I completed the first part of my retreat that I made the trip back down to Tiruvannamalai, and then it became the other part of my life. So half of my year was down there, and the other half, the summers, were up in the foothills and Dustmile. So that was basically how it came about. But from the moment I went back there in 2009, I felt that I was deeply, deeply rooted in that place. To me, it felt like the ultimate Dzogchen place. Everything was magnified there. There was a certain dynamic in the atmosphere. This very charged place. So yeah, it was a dynamo for me, and I was like a little magnet finding its way home, basically. And it still is like that for me. It still is. This will be the first year that I haven't gone back. I won't be able to go for a winter or whatever.
Yeah. That's actually, I remember that was one of the original reasons, why I contacted you a couple of years ago in the first place, because I was reading your blog and some of your writings, and where you talked about both Buddhism and Dzogchen specifically, and then Hinduism and Advaita and Ramana Maharshi in particular, in the same book or in the same text. So that to me was
blog.
Huh?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
In the same blog, yeah.
Yeah, that to me was interesting, because usually Buddhists don't. Usually Buddhists don't do that. So that to me was very interesting. Yeah.
Well, my focus has always only ever been on, well, who am I?
Yeah.
That was always a burning question for me. So when I met Khyentse Rinpoche, that was the burning question.
Yeah.
When I met, and he introduced me to that again, and Chatral Rinpoche carried that on. That was always the main theme of my relationship with my teachers. So it didn't matter to me what tradition they were from. If they were completely stable in their true nature, I mean, that's all there is. You know, any great master from any tradition who has recognized his true nature, you know, the religious stuff doesn't matter. That falls away because they are the same within that truth of recognition. So that was never an issue for me. It was quite irrelevant, actually.
Yeah. And
I really loved the simplicity of Ramana Maharshi's life and his teaching. You know, I like simple things. Short and sweet and straight to the point. I love that.
Yeah. How about, Lisa, you've been close to important masters and have been practicing for a long time. Would you be willing to discuss or describe how practice has changed you? What has changed throughout all these years and practices and connections with masters?
When we really dive into spiritual practice with total sincerity and one-pointed focus, what we're diving into is nothing short of an internal revolution. There's going to be a seismic shift going on in there, you know, at the cellular level, actually. It's profound and it's deep. There may be moments when everything is apparent in that moment, but there's also a process that takes its own time.
Yeah.
Now, Ramana Maharshi was an utterly ripe fruit, so that when he heard the name Arunachala, and when he had his near-death experience, he immediately recognized the truth, and he never strayed from that. But having said that, he spent 20 years in silence at the temple at the foot of Arunachala, stabilizing, and then again learning how to live in the world whilst holding this tremendous, I mean, you know, in the Hindu tradition, they have this analogy of the rope that's burnt. So when you burn a heshing rope, you know, it might be coiled there and it might still look like a rope. But if you touch it, it will just disintegrate. Well, Ramana Maharshi was like that. You know, nothing of the ego remained in him. So he had so completely stabilized and settled into that. And even that, with that kind of a master, took time. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche was in retreats for 20, 25 years. Chatral Rinpoche, something equal to that. Every realized being has gone off and spent time stabilizing their practice. So it's a process. It's a process that just comes into your life in a very organic way. And what we see happening now, of course, is that people are being told that, you know, they're going to get something fast and they can get it if they pay for it. And it's not going to take long. And you know, it's just all so very, very doable, which it is. I don't deny that. But there's much, much more to it than that, you know. And I've seen over the years so many people coming, they're so inspired, they're full of enthusiasm, very idealistic, you know, they're just rearing to go. All the energy's there. And, you know, things happen, life happens, and it never happens the way that we think it will. And things don't always meet our expectations either. In fact, they seldom do. And so what can happen is, you know, disappointment, frustration, all kinds of stuff like that. And then people slowly falling away from their practice, whatever it may be, and then gradually going back to ordinary life, you know, just getting fed up and disappointed. And it's such a pity. It's such a pity, because I think there's not enough emphasis on the fact that in the first place, we need to come into spiritual practice with a tremendous amount of forgiveness towards ourselves, kindness towards ourselves, because, you know, we're given these images of extraordinary beings, and we can't live up to them. You know, we're constantly falling down. You know, it takes a long time to stabilize in one's practice. And part of the stabilizing is the falling down and picking yourself up again. Starting right again from that point, from that moment. It's really a moment by moment thing. It's not something you can, you know, you can plot it out and say, well, by that time I'll be such and such. It doesn't work that way. And I think unless we have that kind of really broad, big vessel of inner forgiveness and kindness towards ourselves, we're going to end up feeling very disappointed with ourselves very quickly, because we're going to constantly fail to meet perceived goals and expectations. And that just totally undermines everything. So yeah, consistency, determination, and simplicity, I think, are really key. And of course, forgiveness and compassion towards oneself, which then blossoms out to embrace, you know, so much more.
Beautiful. We have been doing this interview for about 2 hours now already, and yeah. So before wrapping up, I have one more question to go, and that is that what are you currently involved with, and what kind of future plans do you have?
I think currently I'm just involved with whatever's unfolding in my days. I mean, we're all in the midst of this COVID pandemic. And I find myself in Australia. I left India very early this year. It's much earlier than I would normally ever leave. I had a ticket that was already booked for the middle of February, and that ticket had been already in my hands 6 months. So I found myself back in Sydney in the middle of February, and then, you know, just all kinds of things changed. And now, for the first time, I'm not planning my return to Tiruvannamalai just yet. So I've really just, yeah, and I'm just living a life here, trying to connect with things that are in some way meaningful. So there's a little bit of stuff going on with wildlife. There are things coming up with palliative care and bereavement counselling and stuff, things of that kind. I do a bit of writing from time to time, but basically I'm not making plans. Every day is so different and so new and so unpredictable. You know, things are changing. We're in a really dynamic moment in time, and I think we have to be ready for anything, really. So yeah, it's just that day by day thing at the moment. And of course I'm making myself completely accessible to anyone out there that's sincere, that's questioning, that, you know, might want the support of someone who's you know, perhaps been there before them. That sort of thing. So very, very open to sharing and so on along those lines. Yeah. So nothing more than a simple life.
Yeah, actually, one thing that I'd perhaps mention is that I remember when we started corresponding through email and then through Zoom and Skype a little later, I was kind of struck that you know, nobody had asked you to give teachings or share your experiences. And I was like actually shocked about it a little bit, because you know, you have a lot to share, and so just making that as as an additional statement to what you just said, that you're accessible and it's possible to connect with you.
Yeah, but everything has its time and its place, Kim.
Yes.
Everything has its time. And I'm a great believer in that. So yeah, I'm just leaving it up to the universe, basically. But I'm here for now. And the door's open.
Okay, so thank you, Lisa, for this interview. It has been a lovely
Thank you for making it. Thank you for making it possible, Kim.
Yeah, my pleasure, my pleasure. So perhaps this is the, you know, there's a lot more to, you know, unwrap in your story and in your experiences. So perhaps I'll just say that this was part 1 of Lisa's interview, and part 2 will be following after some time. So thanks.
Good stuff. Okay.